Hey guys, today we're going to be checking out the latest season of Fortnite using the RTX 5070 Ti. We're going to be using the Asus TUF version of our 5070 Ti. It's a pretty expensive model, about $1,000. It has 16 gigabytes of GDDR7 video memory, playing on the latest NVIDIA drivers and pairing with 64 gigabytes of DDR5 as well as a 9800X3D. Our CPU pairing here may be a little bit important because when we're testing some of our low settings, I expect the fact that we have a high powerful CPU will actually come into play. Let's check it out. All right, first off here, we're going to start off at 1080p using the performance mode with our frame rate unlimited. So starting off here, we're in our little loading zone. As you can see, absolutely absurd FPS, but most notably here, we'll want to take a look at both our GPU and our CPU utilization. They're both pretty low, interestingly, at this point. I do imagine that, especially at 1080p, we will be in a situation where we are certainly CPU bound, not bottlenecked by our GPU here, but we'll load in and see how things look. Now, in the testing that I've done so far, seems to be that performance mode on DirectX 11 here seems to have an issue with 1% lows when you choose to come in here and kind of just play without a capped frame rate whatsoever. So I am planning on capping it just after seeing what the raw performance is with no cap. Now you can add, your own cap with outside software like RivaTuner Statistics, as well as many other softwares allow you to actually add a more custom frame rate limit. Fortnite does have frame rate limits built in. However, those only go as high as 360 FPS, I believe. So if you wanted higher than that, you would have to go for a more custom solution. We'll go ahead and restart counting here, and you do see that pretty much right away, our 1% lows do take a pretty major dip down. However, honestly, they're not quite as bad as I was expecting and as bad as I was experiencing on some other GPUs. The actual experience of playing here, as you can see our frame time graph, it looks essentially completely flat and really running around, jumping around. It feels very smooth here. I do get some questions sometimes regarding the high FPS, like say if we're getting, 600 FPS, but you only have, let's say, a 360 hertz monitor. Is there any point in having a higher FPS than your monitor actually supports? And there actually are some benefits to having a higher FPS than your monitor supports. And that's mostly just improved, response times and less input latency. But it is, arguable whether or not that's always worth it necessarily. And oftentimes capping your FPS, not only does it, not necessarily look any worse because you're still visually getting the same smoothness, but it oftentimes will improve your 1% lows. So 1% lows looks like they're hovering pretty respectable, not too bad, around 150 here at performance mode. So we'll go in, we'll hop back in, and we'll cap our FPS and see if that improves those 1% lows. So we're just going to go for the highest cap that's offered in game here, which is 360 FPS. So here we are loaded in with that 360 FPS cap. You can see before we start counting that we're essentially sitting right at that cap. Not a huge surprise considering we were at 600 FPS before. As we start counting, and remember we were at right around 150 for our 1% lows. So, doing this, it looks like it isn't really, it's maybe making a slight improvement to our 1% lows. It's pretty marginal though. It seems like we're kind of still sitting right in the same sort of space. So yeah, I don't know. It seems like maybe the cap, because we weren't really having issues before with major stuttering or anything like that, is, handling it pretty much just fine before. Doesn't seem like really it was in need of any sort of correction. But yeah, 5070 Ti definitely reassuring that here at 1080p shouldn't be super surprising. The performance mode here on Fortnite is intended for, lower end hardware, or to take, higher end hardware, mid-tier hardware, and just get absolutely the highest possible FPS that you can get. It's largely CPU dependent. You need the proper CPU to actually produce the frames, to channel them into a playable state. I don't know, it's kind of a hard way to say it, but so it's actually giving us worse performance now, which is kind of strange, but doesn't look like, at least with this particular pairing, that a cap for our FPS is doing any sort of benefit for us. So it still feels like a relatively smooth experience, even with the cap here. Really, where I was noticing issues before was when we were seeing 20 FPS for our 1% lows. Doesn't seem to be the case here, but not super surprising. 5070 Ti is a very, very powerful GPU, and 9800X3D is also a very powerful CPU. 1080p is, a entry level, entry level resolution. Although it is a very popular resolution, it is a resolution that this particular pairing should be able to pretty much dominate in any sort of game, and especially on a game like this when we're playing at performance mode. Shouldn't be super surprising, but really, really great performance here. All right, next up here, we are on DirectX 12, still at 1080p, and we're playing on the low preset at native resolution using TAA for our anti-aliasing. All right, dropping in here on low settings, now on DirectX 12. And when you move from DirectX 11 to DirectX 12, the game does look pretty different, especially when you're going from performance mode over into just the non-performance mode, as opposed to, getting those high FPS more from bumping down your settings and things like that. So we'll go ahead and begin counting here. I will say that DirectX 12 seems to have better performance in general when it comes to the 1% lows. So you'll notice that pretty much right away as you see our 1% lows at around 200. Our general FPS is a bit lower, where we were getting, around 600 or so on our average on performance mode. Now we are seeing right around pretty close to 500, 470 right now. But it also does look pretty bad. In some ways, I do actually think this looks worse than performance mode. Like the textures are very, very low resolution. All the geometry is very, very simple, but it is a nice, compromise. I would honestly rather play on DirectX 12 in general, in my personal opinion. If you're just looking for highest possible FPS, you're going to be between low settings and performance mode. So, this is a place where you will see our utilization go up pretty significantly, although we are still in a place, as you can see, hitting right around 60 on our GPU utilization, now in the 70s. We are still in a place where we are bound by our CPU, but getting extremely smooth frame times, 1% lows are in a incredibly respectable spot to where, I would personally rather play here. We're getting about 100 FPS higher on our 1% lows, leading to a much, much smoother experience. Not that the performance mode was necessarily terrible to begin with, but the other benefit when you are coming in here and playing on DirectX 11, or sorry, DirectX 12, I should say, is that you have a bit of flexibility. So if you wanted to just come in and say that you didn't mind the game looking how it looks now, but you want to just change a few things, like say you just wanted better resolution textures or something like that, you can come in here and independently change those settings with a bit more flexibility here as opposed to performance mode. But really, regardless, takeaway here at 1080p, you are able to get an incredibly competitive FPS. Really no issue whatsoever with this particular pairing. You don't even really need a CPU this powerful to push these frames. You could really get this type of performance with, a 7800X3D, or even just, a less intensive CPU, maybe like a 5800X3D would serve you very well, or 5700X3D would also give you a really, really great performance here. So 500 FPS here, competitive settings, 1080p low on DirectX 12. Super, super happy with this particular performance. And next up here, just bumping up to the medium preset, still just playing on native resolution. So this is kind of what I was talking about when I say that you can come in and independently bump up some settings. We are getting slightly lower FPS, though, most people are likely not playing on a monitor there that you would really notice a super meaningful difference as far as the actual experience playing the game here. So we were closer to 500, now sitting right around 400 or so, a tad bit higher with some dips into the 300s. 1% lows are still very respectable, better than our performance mode. And let's hop into cars, see if this changes anything, if it's any more demanding. I don't really expect it to be, but really medium settings as well. This does bring us a little bit more consistently below 400, just slightly into the high 300s, but you're going to be getting solid performance here at medium settings as well. And again, this is not using any sort of upscaling. This is all native using TAA for our anti-aliasing, which looks totally fine. In my opinion here, it doesn't really look too blurry or anything like that. Fortnite, you don't really need super advanced anti-aliasing in Fortnite. It kind of just has like a pretty, cartoony, simple art style that seems to kind of agree with more, simple versions of anti-aliasing. Like, you don't need DLAA or even using TSR for anti-aliasing. Isn't really super necessary in my opinion. I think, you're better off taking the performance that you have using TAA and kind of just running with it here. And next setting here is high. So the high preset, still native resolution here at 1080p. So high is where we do start to kind of drop down a tad bit. Now, if you have like a 360 hertz monitor, this would be a place where you would no longer be completely maxing out your monitor's refresh rate or completely populating that particular monitor. But still generally a very, very solid performance. I would like to not die here if possible. Okay, thank God. But still, you know, really, really solid FPS sitting around 270. 1% lows are now dropping slightly into the 150s. However, you know, given the fact that our FPS is a little bit lower, you know, a 150, 1% low doesn't feel nearly as bad when you're averaging 300 compared to when you have 150, 1% low, and you're averaging 600. It's a very, very different feeling experience. So definitely a pretty solid experience here. And our GPU utilization is now, looks like it's being fully utilized. Our GPU sitting at around 96 for our utilizations. Video memory is still, you know, well within an acceptable range here at 1080p, even on high settings, just using a little over 4 gigabytes of video memory. Now, I mentioned it in a recent video, but I know a lot of people seem to just want to play, you know, these games on low settings at the highest possible FPS, but I do think it's worth coming in here and testing these settings. I mean, me personally, I don't play Fortnite on low settings. You know, maybe I'm not as competitive as some other people, but I like the look of the game when it looks a little bit better. I mean, you know, it is a pretty looking game. Now, for ray tracing, when we go into our epic settings here coming up next, that's where I kind of agree with that logic, where I don't think it's worth the FPS hit. But here at high settings, you're kind of able to get the best of both worlds. You get good looking visuals, and you still, on a more performant CPU, as we actually just get a pretty significant stutter there, on a more performant GPU like this, you are still, you know, you're not really having to compromise too much, still getting a really respectable FPS. And our last setting here is going to be our epic preset, and then I did come in here and just change our virtual shadows, which goes to high by default with the epic preset, change that over to epic, as well as enabling hardware ray tracing. So this is now using Lumen, which looks great in this game. However, Lumen is a ray tracing technology, so it is a technology that is obviously very demanding and maybe a bit silly to use in a competitive like title like Fortnite. So we'll see how this looks. All right, jumping down here now on max settings here at 1080p. I'm going to land near water just so we can actually see some of these nice effects. But this is still using native resolution, so, you know, I haven't implemented DLSS. I will circle back to low settings and throw on DLSS just because I know some people like to see just the maximum possible FPS that you could even potentially get, though I don't expect it to be that different considering the fact that we weren't actually GPU banned in the first place. But as you can see with our max settings here, the water looks really great. The game in general looks really great. I mean, it's a very pretty looking game when you tune everything and kind of bump everything up. Go ahead and start counting here. Now, the thing is most people playing on PC, most of them have, you know, higher refresh rate than 60 monitors. So, you know, you'd like to at least populate what you have, whether that's 144 or 120 if you're playing on, you know, there's a lot of 4K TVs that support, you know, 120 hertz. So you would like to be at least 120. So while 60 or averaging in the 90s is not necessarily a bad place to be at. And, you know, I mean, I was a console gamer for a long, long time before switching over to PC. But, you know, in my opinion, if you're playing on PC, mouse and keyboard, there is a lot of benefit that comes from having higher refresh rates. So while 95 is not great, it's not really where I would like to be. And, you know, competitive game like this, you're not really going to be stopping and like admiring the scenes, really. Maybe if you're coming in for like an event or something like that and you're really just kind of looking at the game, but you're better off dumping down some of these settings and getting a higher performance. But hey, if you're curious, yeah, the 5070 Ti can handle Lumen, max settings, everything like that, and give you a playable frame rate here at 1080p. However, you know, just in my opinion, it's not really worth, you know, the trade-off of having such a you know, just such a significant hit to your FPS. So you may think, well, this is where upscaling comes in, and that's where you'd be right. So it does support DLSS. We'll just throw on quality here, and that does give us a slight boost to our FPS. However, it is important to note, you know, Fortnite, it's funny because Fortnite has support for a lot of things. But Epic seems to really want to push, their own technologies, and TSR, which is kind of their platform agnostic version of DLSS or FSR, it's their upscaler they like to use. Seems to be at the forefront, meaning that, DLSS here has not received an update in a while. It still uses a CNN model and actually uses one of the older CNN models. So even quality here, I do notice, and most of the time, when we're playing on quality compared to TAA, it actually looks better than, just playing on TAA native. Oftentimes quality looks better. Here, I'm not so sure. It might look maybe the same, if not just a little bit worse. But of course, you do get the extra benefit of now we are in, pretty close to that competitive type range where it would populate, like 120 hertz TV pretty well. And if we did want to come down here and just throw on performance, which is 50% resolution scale, you'll see that really it doesn't give us a super meaningful increase in our FPS. So we are still kind of hovering right around that 120 mark, which is maybe a little bit strange that, dumping down from 66 resolution scale down to 50 is not, increasing our FPS more dramatically. But yeah, just in my opinion, I would probably just not really consider ray tracing in this game, but know that if you do want to use ray tracing, it is there for you. You can get a playable FPS, even in my opinion here at 1080p, it is a competitive FPS. It's just not worth it in my opinion. The game looks good, but unless, you have a really, really powerful CPU, and I'm talking like 5080, 5090, even then it would be arguable whether or not it's really worth it. But in my opinion, you're better off taking the frames, giving yourself, every competitive advantage that you have, especially in a game like Fortnite, where if you die, you're not really looking at anything. You're just looking at a loading screen. You're better off taking those frames and going without the ray tracing, in my opinion. And just to make sure we circle back, I wanted to see what we can get just high as possible. So low settings with DLSS performance. I know some people like to see these settings, so circle back. I don't love to do things out of order like this, but we'll circle back and just see what kind of performance we can get here on low settings with DLSS performance. So dropping in here, you can see getting pretty solid FPS here. 1% lows are taking a bit of a dip. We'll restart counting when we land here. Now, there is a bit of variance, when it comes to where exactly in the map you are, as we can go ahead and restart counting. But here on performance settings, we are, on performance DLS, I should say, we are getting definitely a very, very competitive FPS here, right around 440. So not super surprising. 5070 Ti is a very, very powerful GPU. And if, you own a 5070 Ti, you know that. And if you're looking to buy one, especially at 1080p, it's going to offer you a ton of flexibility as far as just getting, the most performance that you want. If you want a bit more performance, you can really get really, really sick performance out of this thing at 1080p. And if you want to opt for better looking visuals, as we saw even with Epic settings, even with ray tracing, playing it native, everything like that, you can get a really nice FPS. So really, 1080p, this card is designed for well beyond 1080p, so not super surprising again, but 1080p is going to be well within the capabilities of this card, regardless of settings. All right, next up here, moving up to 1440p and starting off on our performance mode, our DirectX 11 performance mode. So we'll start off same thing as before, start off as uncapped. Now, 1440p, this is much more where this card should really be targeting at least. You can have a great experience at 1080p, but really you don't need a 5070 Ti, a card that's powerful to play at 1080p. So, NVIDIA themselves, they market the card and they benchmark it at 1440p. So this particular resolution will really be where we see how the game performs in its intended space. Now, dropping in, we'll go ahead and begin counting. You can see definitely we're still getting high FPS, very, very similar to the type of FPS that we were getting at 1080p. However, our GPU utilization is a bit higher. We're still in a space where it does look like we are CPU bound. It's good to see that the card, given the fact that it is a card that should be targeting a higher resolution than 1080p, that we are still getting those high frames. And really, just like we were seeing with the 1080p performance mode, our 1% lows are actually not too bad. Now, to be honest, when you're getting 1% lows of 150, that may sound high, and it is pretty solid 1% lows, but when you're getting that with an average of around 600 FPS, it does have the tendency to feel at times a bit stuttery. Like, they're hard to pick up on the frame time graph. It's really more just something that you would feel when you're playing. It's almost like these little micro stutters that happen every now and then. Doesn't really meaningfully or drastically change the experience that you're having here, but it is noticeable. And I will just point out once again that this is without the frame rate capped whatsoever. So just giving the raw performance, just say, hey, I want to play at 1440p, but I want the highest possible FPS. This is the kind of space that you're going to be looking at with our 5070 Ti here. So right around 650 FPS or so, with 1% lows really, really solid, right around 180. So let's see if that changes or improves at all if we apply a frame rate limit. So we'll just go for the max here at 360. So as a reminder, our 1% low, which is the main thing, if I can make it out of this firefight here. Okay, so the 1% lows is the main thing we're really going to be looking at, where we were getting 180 before with an uncapped frame rate, just to see, is that any better with a capped frame rate? And it actually, at least to begin with here, doesn't really look like it is meaningfully better. In fact, it's actually a bit worse. Now, just in general, when your FPS is lower, having a lower 1% low is just kind of feels more natural. So it's not as severe swinging down from 360 to 140. However, we're not playing on a super high refresh rate monitor. We're playing on a 240 hertz monitor, and so there is definitely diminishing returns as far as actually noticing some of these things. But yeah, here, if I were to be playing at performance settings, I'd probably just go uncapped. We're getting better 1% lows uncapped. A little bit more wild as far as our swing and FPS, but, I don't even know if they really make 1440p monitors that would support something as high as 360 hertz, maybe, but definitely not like 600 hertz monitors. I don't think those exist beyond 1080p, but I would probably opt for going for just the uncapped mode personally. All right, now moving up to DirectX 12, so just our standard mode, and we're going to go for the low preset here, and we're just using TAA for our anti-aliasing, and then we're just going to be playing at native 100% resolution scale. So low settings at native, and we'll see how this runs, and then we'll check it out too with performance DLSS, just to kind of get a feel for the highest possible DirectX 12 FPS as well. So here on low settings, really what we're going to be comparing this to is mostly the performance settings on DirectX 12 or DirectX 11. They're very, very similar settings, just kind of targeting highest possible FPS. Now the difference, if you go back and forth, you can see there is a pretty significant difference in just the visuals between DirectX 12 and DirectX 11 performance mode. DirectX 12 has like better lighting, looks a bit more, I don't want to say realistic, but there's just a bit more dynamic lighting, kind of just like the shaders and everything. Everything just looks a little bit differently. Now, playing here, as I'll begin counting, playing here on low settings, some things look worse, like our textures are incredibly low. But really, as you can see, the main thing that you're really going to be experiencing that's a good thing is the fact that our 1% lows are considerably better. Now that is at the cost of some FPS, as you can see where we were getting on performance mode around 600 FPS. Now we're getting around 470, so there is a drop off in our FPS, but for most people, you're definitely better off, in my opinion, going for the higher 1% lows, resulting in just smoother gameplay, smoother experience in general. You're going to be way better off with that. And this is all at native so far. I'm going to introduce DLSS for the first time here coming up shortly, just to see, max possible FPS. But you can see, our GPU utilization is also climbing a bit higher, a bit more comfortably and commonly in the 80s and 90s, as opposed to, hovering around the 70s and 80s at performance mode. Performance mode does a few things. I think some people prefer performance mode, not only for the FPS, but also just for, things just look a bit more simple. So it's a bit maybe easier to kind of tell where an enemy might be. There's less like visual noise to kind of have to sift through to actually just perform in a competitive sense. So I do definitely understand that perspective, but my opinion, this looks simple enough that I think that most people, including myself, would be able to pretty much be as competitive as I would be regardless. I don't think turning on performance mode would really increase my odds of, getting an elimination or spotting an enemy or anything like that. And I'm definitely happier to be at 200 FPS for our 1% lows as opposed to around 180. It is actually kind of noticeable, bumping up our 1% lows by about 30 or so. It's a pretty noticeable difference, in my opinion. Now, of course, this being an NVIDIA card, we do have the ability to throw on a bit of DLSS. Now, DLSS on 1440p does look considerably better than DLSS at 1080p. So putting on performance here should, it'll hurt our image quality a bit, but it should also give us a pretty substantial performance increase. So we'll see how that looks. And just because, we're going for highest possible performance here, we're just going to throw on DLSS at performance. This is 50% resolution scale, still on low settings. And this does net us a pretty significant increase as far as our 1% lows. So now 1% lows sitting around 300 FPS. Incredibly competitive experience here. So really this enters the range where I don't think really anyone reasonably could say that they don't have, the best possible performance advantage here. I mean, you're getting essentially perfect performance, super flat frame times. You can see that, there's odd spikes here and there. A lot of that is just going to be, engine related stuff that's going to be very challenging to completely eliminate and address. But overall, this looks solid at 1440p. When you start introducing DLSS, you're already operating from a pretty high resolution that, the DLSS is not necessarily going to be like super terrible. I mean, if you really take a close look at like some fine edges and things like that, you could probably notice some things. But as far as a competitive, experience here, you're not really going to be stopping and smelling the roses, looking at the scenes and things like that. You're just, playing the game as, competitive game. So you're really just looking for the best possible experience as far as your FPS goes. And this does certainly get you that. Gives you a increase to your 1% lows sitting around 280. Our average now 447, 450, right around there. Definitely a really solid, smooth experience, and definitely a good place to be at if you are just someone who wants, most competitive type experience here, but doesn't really want to deal with, some of the weirdness that comes with performance mode. Even with capping your FPS, performance mode nets us, I mean, when we capped our FPS, we're at 150. When we didn't, we're at 180. 100 FPS increase to our 1% lows is pretty significant. So, I would definitely prefer going for low settings if I was looking for that competitive advantage as opposed to, going for that performance mode on DirectX 11. Now, still at 1440p, now on medium settings and back to our native TAA resolution. And medium settings here also, in my opinion, for my money, this is a totally competitive experience for someone like me, a 300 FPS average. Definitely more than I would really ever need in a game like Fortnite. I mean, for me, I kind of have these benchmarks in my head, what I think of as a competitive experience. Something like Fortnite, I just want to be like around 120 FPS or higher in order for me to, if I'm really looking to compete, to win, that's all I care about. That's where I want to be. Whether that includes DLSS or not is kind of irrelevant. I just want to be at a high FPS. The actual visuals and, some artifacting with upscaling, to me, that's kind of secondary. I'd like to have, good experience there, but, in my opinion, 300 FPS is a really solid place to be. I mean, you could ask for more in some situations. I understand that there definitely are higher refresh rate monitors that would be, looking for a bit more, but here, medium settings, native resolution, no need for any upscaling in my personal opinion. I only really want to test the upscaling for the lower settings. Just, I understand if someone, I have a 1440p monitor, I want the highest possible FPS, but in that case, playing at medium settings, you're better off just going for low, getting that highest possible FPS. I don't think that really, Fortnite looks pretty solid regardless of settings. So, here at medium, getting around 300 FPS, I don't think that there is a super significant or important need for any sort of upscaling. 1% lows are also very solid, right around 160. I say 160 solid at a 300 average because that definitely feels different than having a 150 average, or sorry, a 600 FPS average with a 150 1% low. So in my opinion, this is definitely a totally great place to be at on medium settings. And now bumping up to our high preset, still at native resolution. And high at native is still well within the capabilities of our 5070 Ti here. Definitely now in a place where we do seem to be GPU bound, which is a good thing. It's typically where you want to be in most games. Not always the case for competitive titles. Is a lot of times in competitive lightweight titles like Fortnite, some other competitive games, Counter-Strike, stuff like that, you will be CPU bound, but typically you do want to be bound by your most important and expensive component of your PC, and that 9 times out of 10 will be your GPU. So getting around 200 FPS, a pretty significant drop off from our medium settings, I will say, but definitely you are starting to see the game look much, much prettier. I mean, this is definitely more of closer to where you would see like the consoles play at, but now we're getting definitely a much, much higher frame rate than you would get on console. So definitely a really solid experience here. I mean, 5070 Ti, it's a 1440p card, so really, in my opinion, to be considered a 1440p card, really what I would like to see is just for it to handle high or max settings at native 1440p and get us whatever our desired frame rate is. So a game like Fortnite, I would like to see about 120 FPS at all settings. Now, this game does have some pretty intensive settings when it comes to ray tracing that we'll see when we switch over to Epic here in a second. So when we get to that point, I don't expect us to be getting a native 120 FPS, but good to see that even on high settings here, we are not only getting 120 FPS, we're actually getting far, far beyond that. So definitely pretty happy with the performance so far. And now our final preset here, going for Epic. This is going to turn everything on max here, and we'll go ahead and enable hardware ray tracing. So this does now put us into the place where we are using Lumen Epic. I should note that for the high settings, Lumen was not enabled due to the fact that we weren't doing a restart. So this is now completely maxed out Epic settings. Now, I should mention as we begin taking a look here, ray tracing and Lumen and playing it native, all this stuff. This kind of makes sense more so for like single player titles. For a competitive game like Fortnite, I don't think many people would be playing here at high settings or the maxed out ray trace settings. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this benchmark, but I do think it's just kind of interesting to see what the card can do, as we did unlock our Superman skin. So this is kind of a interesting little dive animation that we have going on here, but this is obviously not really how most people would play the game, but I do think it's interesting just to see what the card is capable of at max settings, at native resolution. You can see right to begin with here, we haven't started counting yet because we haven't landed yet, but our frame time graph does seem to be a bit all over the place. So we'll see how that translates to our 1% lows as we begin counting here. But while you can play this, certainly native resolution, max out settings, I wasn't expecting to get a competitive, frame rate here or competitive type experience, but I'm honestly a bit maybe surprised that we are actually getting, above 60 FPS at maxed out 1440p. Now, I'm sure many people out there maybe would be okay playing at 60 FPS in Fortnite. On PC with mouse and keyboard, in my opinion, it's not a great experience. You'd like to be getting a higher FPS. 60 FPS feels okay on console with a controller, but when we're talking about going to a PC experience, it is pretty dramatically different. But 1% lows are all relatively okay. I mean, it's around 50, which isn't showing any major signs of super significant stutters. Average at 74. Definitely a pretty solid place to play at. If you just kind of wanted to come in here, maybe during an event or something like that, you kind of just wanted the game to look as good as possible, native resolution, you can certainly do that. Now, we should go find maybe some water to actually see how our FPS tanks when we actually get to see some of these nice effects. That's the other thing with Fortnite too, is when you're introducing all of these fancy effects, oftentimes you're just going to be kind of running around these kind of settings. Sure, stuff like a glowing chest might look a little bit more dramatic than otherwise, but it's not really going to make a massive difference in your actual experience playing the game most of the time. Really we have to kind of find some water to see the nice reflections, but typically what you're doing is you're trading off a lot of performance for what ends up being pretty minimal visual gains. So as we come down to some water, you do see that we have these nice ray trace reflections. Definitely looks nice, but Now we're dropping down a bit more even into the 60s, so a little bit more off our average. So not a super great experience, and not really where I would recommend that you play, or really that, I think anyone would really decide to play on their own anyways. Now let's go ahead and we'll test some of our DLSS settings. So just throwing on quality, see where this brings us. And this does give us a pretty nice boost now up into the 90s. This does feel quite a bit smoother. But, still, the fact that we were getting nearly 200 FPS without the need for any sort of upscaling on our lower settings. And the game still looked pretty solid even then. So, again, I just don't really think that it's worth the trade-off. But let's just dump down all the way down to performance, DLSS. And, this is kind of the same experience that I was seeing at 1080p. Performance as opposed to quality actually doesn't really seem to net us that much in terms of any sort of improvement. Still hovering right around 90. So, yeah, I mean, you can certainly play here at maxed out settings at 1440p. It's not going to be a competitive experience. Even with some upscaling, it's not going to get you there, at least when we talk about DLSS. But, I know some people are, firm believers that TSR looks much, much better. So let's just go for TSR performance, see if this does anything better. And TSR, even at performance settings, seems to give us pretty similar performance here with what I would consider to be slightly worse looking picture. So yeah, I'm not necessarily disappointed in the performance here at 1440p. I kind of think these settings, I'm probably spending too much time on them as is, but I don't think these settings are really a place that many people should really be looking to play at, unless, you're ultra casual Fortnite player. You don't even really care about winning. Maybe you're just playing with friends. Maybe you're just kind of coming in here and playing super casually in some of the alternate modes, like, the Lego mode or stuff like that. But if you're coming in here and you have any intention of actually giving yourself, a competitive advantage or competitive type FPS, leave ray tracing off. It's, it looks nice in some situations, but to be honest, you can kind of get 90% of the way there with just bumping up some high settings, and you're not going to be sacrificing nearly as much in terms of your actual performance. And now bumping up to our final resolution here, we're at 4K full screen and back on our DirectX 11 performance mode with unlimited FPS. Now, as we begin looking at some 4K, I will say, this card is not a 4K card necessarily, but NVIDIA cards in general do have a tendency to kind of punch up. So what would be considered a 1440p card, especially when we look at, like competitive games like Fortnite, can actually perform pretty well at 4K. So as you can see, we are right away in a place where we are GPU bound, which is a good thing here at performance settings, and we are getting a very, very competitive high FPS of about 400. And as we begin counting, this is definitely a place where I do want to keep an eye on our 1% lows, see if it does, vary at all now that we are at a bit higher of a resolution. But honestly, to begin with here, it looks relatively okay. 140 feels okay. There are like odd stutters here and there that are kind of just par for the course when you're playing a game like Fortnite. Unreal Engine 5 just has a habit of kind of having some stutters. A bit disappointing, especially considering, we're playing on the Unreal Engine game, like the main game that supports Unreal Engine, being Fortnite. But yeah, we do still have those stutters. So coming down from 500 and having our 1% lows at 135 just kind of shows, if you look closely at our frame time graph, there are just these little peaks here and there. You don't always feel them, and honestly, most of the time it feels okay. 130 is not a terrible place to be at really whatsoever. But if you're just looking for, you had a 4K monitor, or you wanted to hook up to a 4K TV or something like that, and you had a 5070 Ti, as long as you have a good processor that can kind of handle it, the 5070 Ti will serve you well, and it does seem like it can actually give you the performance that you're looking for here, around 530. 1% lows down at 147. Let's go ahead and we'll limit our FPS to 360 just to see if that changes or improves things at all. And doesn't really seem like it's funny. In some other tests, I was actually seeing a pretty, noticeable improvement when we were limiting our FPS, but it doesn't actually seem to make much of a difference here. In fact, it's actually resulting in worse performance. However, I would say, if you are playing on performance mode, or really if you're playing and you have a super high FPS, regardless of if you're on DirectX 11 or DirectX 12, I would just test out limiting your FPS just to see if that does improve things at all. I have seen other tests, even though it's not really happening here, that limit does seem to kind of improve things. And, in this place, we are pretty much course, we were at around 500 to 600 FPS, so we are getting pretty much a rock solid 360 with just some odd stutters here and there. So definitely doable 4K on performance mode. And now moving over to 4K DirectX 12 on the low settings. These are all low settings at TAA native. So now dropping in here, DirectX 12 on low settings. Things do look considerably better. We are playing it native, so 4K resolution is pretty taxing just due to the fact that we are on native. However, the CPU pairing is definitely helping us out quite a bit here, averaging around, looks like around 260. We'll go ahead and begin counting as soon as we land here. And 1% lows, we'll keep an eye on those as well. But definitely, to begin with here, pretty solid performance. And, it's just my personal opinion, but I definitely prefer the look of the game on DirectX 12 as opposed to, dumping down to DirectX 11 on performance. There is a slight drop off in our actual performance here, coming down to around 300 when we were at the 400s prior. But, still very, very solid performance here. Definitely would be a pretty solid place to play at, and a place that I would personally prefer playing at as opposed to, going for those DirectX 11 settings. So 4K, as long as your CPU can handle it, 5070 Ti is not going to be holding you back. Only using, even at 4K, just about 4 gigabytes of video memory. So definitely a really, really solid performing GPU here. Really no need for any upscaling. So let's go ahead and we'll bump up to our medium settings. And even medium settings seem to give us a very, very performance type experience. So in my opinion, you could obviously introduce DLSS, get a bit more, but to my eye, the game looks great here, and we are getting, above 200 FPS. Not really a super significant need for any sort of upscaling. Even on medium settings, game looks absolutely great. And honestly, this might be right about where I'd want to be if I were to be playing this game at 4K on this GPU, because you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. You're getting a native resolution picture, which, in my opinion, I just kind of like to have, regardless of if, DLSS looks essentially native or not. But you're playing on high enough settings that the game still looks pretty solid, but there's not a ton of, visual clutter to where it's necessarily hurting your performance, or where you're really, sacrificing your competitive advantage for too much good looking visuals. Even without ray tracing, you can see it still does a good job of kind of like, quote unquote, faking it without the real time ray tracing. You see like trees, all these like bamboo sticks. You still get all those nice reflections, just without, the need for so much of a performance hit. And one last setting before I forget, let's go for the low setting with DLSS set to performance. So this will be really, the highest possible FPS that you can get, aside from going to that DirectX 11 performance mode. Gets us around 300, and a really solid increase to our 1% lows to sitting at around 180. So really, smooth flat frame times as far as Fortnite goes. Can't really ask for much better than this. Definitely very, very happy with this performance, and to be getting this kind of performance at 4K on a card that's really designed for 1440p, despite the fact that yes, it is a competitive title, you should be getting this type of performance. It's definitely still pretty nice to see. And next up here is our high preset, and we're at native TAA, so this is high. This does start to introduce Lumen here, which at 1440p this was not enabled, so my apologies for that. We'll go ahead and check hardware ray tracing on as well. So hardware ray tracing Lumen high at native TAA. So here on high settings, now that we have our ray tracing turned on, this is definitely where we're going to start to see things kind of tank as far as our FPS. Now, not going to spend a ton of time on these settings, just due to the fact that I really don't think that many people are going to be playing 4K with ray tracing and expect super high FPS. I think if you're playing on these settings, maybe you're using DLSS, but even then, if you're playing on a 5070 Ti, as you can see, we're already sub 60 flying in here. Now the water does look great. Some of these effects do look really impressive with Lumen set to high. Although I'm noticing some like popping on the reflections, which is kind of ugly looking. But as you can see, around 60, right around 60 looks like, but really, dipping below 60. Frame time graph, although our 1% lows are pretty respectable, frame time graph is all over the place, just due to the fact that we are kind of getting pretty wild swings in our FPS depending on what exactly the scene is that we're kind of looking at. You can see like here, doing what we're doing now, just trying to jump up, mantle this box. We're getting in the 70s. Go ahead and pick up our ammo here. Now we're into the 50s. You know, dropping like 15 FPS sometimes doesn't feel too bad, but when we're operating from a pretty low FPS and it's such a high percentage of your FPS, it does result in a pretty dramatic, actually like feels pretty dramatic as far as those changes go. So this is where, you know, you would hope that DLSS could save you and bring you up into a playable state. So we'll go ahead, we'll throw on DLSS at performance. And this does now get us into a place where we are getting 60 plus FPS. So 4K, you know, high settings here with ray tracing, you can get 60 plus FPS. But, you know, when we're talking about going from non-ray tracing modes like at medium, the game looks already pretty solid and we're getting such a competitive like experience coming down all the way here to around 100 FPS, you know, nearly halving our FPS. Just not really worth it in my opinion. I mean, the game looks great if you're just, you know, again, coming in here and just kind of want to experience an event or just want to check stuff out, finish some quests. You're not really looking to compete, win, you know, you can certainly do that and have the game look really nice and pretty, but not really worth it in my opinion. And for our final test here, we're going to go for still 4K native TAA maxed settings. So now turning from Lumen High to Lumen Epic, and our preset is on Epic. So these are just the max possible settings you can run Fortnite on. So dropping in here, you can see just a bit more performance hit. We'll go over to this water just to, you know, while we're our low FPS, we may as well look at something pretty. But obviously, you know, playing at 40 FPS is really not where anyone really wants to be at in Fortnite. I mean, you can make a case, maybe 60 is okay, 40, even on a handheld like a Switch 2 or even the original Switch or something like that. You know, you don't want to be at 40 FPS. Frame time graph is all over the place. We'll go ahead and start counting here. Not that it really matters, but, you know, the reflections look nice. I mean, everything looks really nice, but, you know, at the cost of so much of an FPS, obviously not really where you want to be at whatsoever. So around 40, 1% low at 27, frame time graph all over the place. Video memory at around 10 gigabytes. We are, of course, fully utilizing our GPU, but you know, the game looks pretty. I mean, definitely looks pretty. And, you know, you can make the case. You can still come in here, take screenshots, experience events. Not a terrible, terrible experience, but not really where I imagine anyone would want to play at. And we'll be looking for a miracle to try to fix this. So let's just throw on DLSS performance. And DLSS performance actually does come in here and give us a plus, you know, above 60 FPS. So, you know, you can make the case, you know, if you just want to play at max settings, experience an event. Once again, you know, I've made that case before. You can play here and get 60 plus FPS, but, you know, as far as like actually coming into Fortnite, playing the game, trying to win, you know, competitively or anything like that, these are not at all the settings that you're going to want to go for. Anyways, guys, that's been it for Fortnite on the 5070 Ti. The 5070 Ti really performs very well at 1440p. You can play at max settings, use a bit of DLSS, as long as you are okay with around 60 FPS. But, you know, as far as performance settings, everything's on the table. You know, you can play at low settings, medium settings, DirectX 12, performance mode, get a super competitive FPS all the way up to 4K. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, this is a pass for the card and really solid performance. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.